We're now going to look at solving using the quadratic formula. Once again, this solves all quadratics. Factoring is limited because if it doesn't factor, you can't solve it. The square root method doesn't work very well because if you have an x squared and an x, you're not able to take the square root. Completing the square is good, except if you end up getting an odd b value, what you end up getting is a fraction. That's really difficult. But the quadratic formula, it's long, but it is the method that always works. So here we have the quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now, we talked about the discriminant last time, and notice that inside the quadratic formula is the discriminant. So the discriminant tells us how many solutions there are because it is inside the square root. When a square root is equal to 0, it has one solution because the plus or minus is going to be the same, whether I add 0 or subtract 0. If our square root is positive, there's going to be two solutions, a positive and a negative. And then if our b squared minus 4ac is negative, we can't take the square root of a negative. So that's why it's no solutions. So those were the reasons for the discriminant being no solution if it's negative, one solution if it's 0, or if it's greater than 0, two solutions. Now, what I recommend is going online and listening to the quadratic formula. There's a lot of good songs that help you remember it. It's one of those formulas that's going to follow you throughout your math career. The one that I like the most is the one that sounds like Pop Goes the Weasel. But if you look online, it'll kind of go through that lots of times and it'll be stuck in your mind, and it's really helpful. So once again, how it kind of goes is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Once again, I recommend going online, looking that up, and the formula will be ingrained in your mind. Now, using it, we're going to find our a, b, and c values. Our a value is 1. Our b value is negative 1, and our c value is negative 6. Once again, a is in front of the x squared, b is in front of the x, c is the number by itself. It always has to be equal to 0 in order to solve it. So we have x equals, notice that this is a negative b. So if I plug in a negative and negative is a positive. We could think of the negative as the opposite of b. So if b is negative 1, then negative b would be positive 1. Plus or minus the square root, we have negative 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6 all over 2 times 1. Now, once we have it plugged in, all we're going to be doing is simplifying it. So we have 1 plus or minus the square root. Negative 1 squared is 1. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 6 is a positive 24 all over 2. So x equals 1 plus or minus 1 plus 24 is 25, and we know that the square root of 25 is 5 all over 2. Now what we're going to do is we're going to solve 1 plus 5 is 6. When we divide it by 2, that gives us a 3. 1 minus 5 is negative 4. Divided by 2 is negative 2. So we have two answers, 3 or negative 2. Now, if we look at letter B, what we're going to do is we're going to plug in our values. So A is 2, B is 8, C is 4. So we go x equals, we have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 2 times 4. Then we're going to divide the whole thing by 2 times 2. So x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 32 all over 4. Then we're going to simplify this. X equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 32 over 4. 32 is 16 and 2, and the square root of 16 is 4. So that gives us x equals negative 8 plus or minus 4 square root of 2 over 4. All of them are divisible by 4, so that gives us x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. Now, looking at letter C. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to move the 4 over, and that's by adding 4. So what we have is a positive 4. So 3x squared minus x plus 4 is equal to 0. So A is 3, B is negative 1, and C is 4. So x equals 1. Remember, it's always the opposite. Plus or minus the square root. We have negative 1 squared minus 4 times 3 times 4 all over 2 times 3. That gives us 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 minus 48 all over 6. And 1 minus 48 gives us negative 47. And we can't take a square root of a negative, so this is no solution. So if you remember what we said earlier, whenever our discriminant, and the discriminant is the value in there, is a negative, we're getting no real solution. So it's no solution. Pause the video and try the next two on your own. Now, if we're looking at letter D, we have A equals 1, B equals 6, C equals 9. So we have x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root. We have 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9. And we're dividing the whole thing by 2 times 1. So x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root. We have 36 minus 36 all over 2. And we know that 36 minus 36 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. So what we're left with is x is equal to negative 6 over 2. And then that, of course, is negative 3. So as we talked about earlier, when our discriminant is 0, we're only having one solution. So for our last one, our A value is 4, our B value is 2, our C value is negative 1. So we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root. We have 2 squared minus 4 times negative 1, and we divide the whole thing by 2 times 4. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root. We have 4, negative and negative is a positive, so that's plus 16 all over 8. X equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 20. And 20, the square root of 20 breaks down to 4 and 5. And we know the square root of 4 is 2. So what we have is negative 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 5 all over 8. Now, if we're looking at this, what we notice is that we have even values, and they're all divisible by 2. So that means that we have negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 5 over 4. Because if we divide all of them by 2, the 2 becomes a negative 1, the 2 becomes a 1, and the 8 becomes a 4.